The day my son Brian showed up at my door demanding $50,000 for his new business venture, after not seeing his own children for 6 months, was the day I decided that every penny of my money would go to those abandoned kids through their mother, who he had left broke and struggling, while he chased his dreams of becoming the next tech millionaire. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. My name is William Turner, but everyone calls me Bill, and I'm 71 years old sitting in my home office in Denver, Colorado, looking at pictures of my grandchildren Emma and Jacob, who I see more than their own father does. Because apparently being a dad doesn't fit into Brian's vision of success and financial freedom that he keeps posting about on LinkedIn, while his kids wonder why daddy doesn't come to their soccer games anymore. Let me take you back to when this all started, because this isn't just about money or custody, but about watching my own son become everything. I tried to teach him not to be a man who values ambition over family wealth over responsibility and his own ego over the children he brought into this world, and then abandoned when being a father became inconvenient. Brian is 38 years old and was always the golden child, the one who got straight A's, went to Cornell on partial scholarship, and landed a job at a tech startup in Silicon Valley, right out of college, making 6 figures before he was 25. And I was so proud of him, thinking I had raised a successful man, not realizing that success without character is just failure dressed in expensive clothes. He married Rachel 12 years ago, and she was perfect for him. Or so I thought, a kindergarten teacher who balanced out his intensity with her warmth and patience. And when Emma was born 10 years ago, followed by Jacob 2 years later, I thought Brian had everything a man could want: a beautiful family, a successful career, and parents who supported him in every way possible. But something changed in Brian around 5 years ago when he started his first startup company and became obsessed with becoming the next Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, spending 18-hour days at the office, missing birthdays, anniversaries, and school plays. Because there was always one more meeting, one more pitch, one more investor to chase, while Rachel held everything together at home. The company failed after burning through $2 million in investor money, and Brian's response wasn't to reassess his priorities, but to immediately start planning his next venture, convinced that he was just one idea away from billions, while his family became increasingly invisible to him, except when he needed Rachel to play the supportive wife at company events. Rachel tried everything to save their marriage: counseling, therapy, even offering to move closer to his office so he could see the kids more, but Brian's response was that she didn't understand the pressure he was under, and that sacrifices had to be made now so they could all live like royalty later, which was his way of justifying his absence from his children's lives. The divorce happened 2 years ago, and it was brutal, with Brian fighting tooth and nail over every asset, not because he wanted them, but because he didn't want Rachel to have them, even trying to claim that her teacher's pension should be considered marital property, while simultaneously arguing that his stock options in his new company were separate assets. He got the house in the divorce because it was technically in his name from before the marriage, but he sold it immediately to fund his new startup and moved into a luxury apartment in downtown Denver that cost $4,000 a month, while Rachel and the kids had to move in with her parents because she couldn't afford rent on a teacher's salary. The custody agreement gave Brian every other weekend and Wednesday dinners, but he started missing them almost immediately, claiming urgent business trips or investor meetings that couldn't be rescheduled. And within 6 months, he had seen Emma and Jacob exactly 4 times, always distracted by his phone and cutting visits short because something important came up. Child support was supposed to be $3,000 a month based on his previous salary, but Brian quit his job to focus on his startup, and claimed he had no income, so the court reduced it to $800 a month, which barely covered daycare for Jacob, while Emma had to quit her dance classes and soccer team because Rachel couldn't afford the fees anymore. Meanwhile, Brian was posting on social media about his entrepreneurial journey, showing pictures of himself at conferences, networking events, and expensive restaurants, with potential investors, talking about grinding and hustling, and sacrificing everything for success, while his children were wearing hand-me-down clothes and eating mac and cheese for dinner 3 nights a week. I tried talking to him about his responsibilities as a father, but he would get defensive, saying that once his company took off, he would give Emma and Jacob everything they could ever want, and that Rachel was poisoning them against him by making him look like the bad guy when he was really just trying to build a future for everyone. The truth was that Brian had become addicted to the idea of success, to the validation that comes from being called a CEO and founder, to the possibility of wealth and fame that always seemed just one investment round away, while the real treasures in his life, his children, were growing up without him and learning that Daddy cared more about his company than about them. Rachel never badmouthed Brian to the kids, even though she had every right to, instead making excuses for why Daddy couldn't make it to the school play or the birthday party. But I could see the hurt in Emma's eyes when she would ask if Daddy was coming, and Rachel would have to say he was busy working, because that's what Daddy always was, busy working on everything except being a father. I started stepping in more, taking the kids to their activities, having them over for weekends, helping Rachel with groceries and school supplies, because that's what grandfathers do when fathers abandon their posts. And I watched my grandchildren slowly stop asking about their dad and start calling me when they needed help with homework or wanted to share good news about school. 6 months ago, Brian's latest startup failed spectacularly after he burned through $500,000 in seed funding, with nothing to show for it except a half-built app and a lot of broken promises to investors who were now threatening legal action for misrepresentation of how their money was being used, which was typical Brian, all flash and no substance. That's when he showed up at my door for the first time in 4 months, not to see how I was doing or to ask about his children, but to demand $50,000 to start yet another company, because apparently the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over while expecting different results, and Brian was nothing if not insane when it came to chasing success. He had a whole presentation prepared on his laptop about this revolutionary new idea that would definitely work this time, showing me market projections and user acquisition strategies and revenue models, while never once asking about Emma's recent surgery to remove her tonsils or Jacob's struggles with reading that Rachel had been handling alone while working full-time. I sat there listening to him pitch me like I was a venture capitalist, instead of his father, watching him get animated about blockchain technology and artificial intelligence and disrupting traditional industries, while his own children were probably having dinner at their grandmother's house again, because Rachel was working her second job tutoring to make ends meet. When he finished his presentation, he looked at me expectantly and said, "So, what do you think, Dad? Will you invest in your son's future?" And I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd that he thought I would give him money to chase another pipe dream, while his actual future, his children, were struggling because of his neglect. I told him I would think about it, and he left looking confident that I would come through, because I always had, before bailing him out of credit card debt, funding his MBA, paying for his wedding, and giving him the down payment for the house he had sold to fund his delusions of grandeur. But this time would be different. This time, there would be consequences. The next day, I called Rachel and asked her to meet me for coffee, And when she showed up looking exhausted from working 2 jobs and raising 2 kids alone, I told her I wanted to help, but not in the way Brian expected. And the relief on her face when I explained my plan made me both happy and furious that she had been carrying this burden alone for so long. I set up education trusts for Emma and Jacob, each funded with $25,000, the exact amount Brian had asked for, but that he would never touch because the money would go directly to their education expenses. And Rachel would be the trustee with full control over how it was used for the children's benefit, not their father's schemes. I also started giving Rachel $2,000 a month directly, not as charity, but as grandparent support for my grandchildren's needs: music lessons, sports equipment, clothes, dental care, all the things Brian should have been providing, but wasn't because he was too busy trying to become a billionaire to remember he was already supposed to be a father. When Brian found out, he was furious, calling me a traitor and saying I was undermining him as a father by giving money to his ex-wife instead of investing in his future. But I calmly explained that I was investing in the only future that mattered: Emma and Jacob's future, which he had abandoned the moment it became inconvenient for his ambitions. He threatened to take me to court, claiming elder abuse and manipulation, but his lawyer quickly informed him that grandparents giving money to their grandchildren through the custodial parent was perfectly legal, and actually made him look worse for not providing adequate support himself, which shut down that avenue of attack. Then he tried emotional manipulation, saying I was choosing Rachel over my own son, and that I was destroying our relationship by taking her side in the divorce. But I reminded him that there were no sides when it came to children's well-being, and that he had destroyed our relationship when he became a stranger to his own kids, while expecting me to fund his fantasies. He actually had the audacity to show up at Emma's school play, not to watch her perform, but to corner Rachel and demand she give him access to the trust funds, claiming it was his money since it came from his father. But Rachel held firm, and security had to escort him out when he started making a scene embarrassing Emma, who just wanted her dad to watch her be a tree in the second-grade production of The Rainforest. The next manipulation tactic was trying to use the kids as leverage, suddenly showing interest in his visitation rights and taking them for a weekend, where he spent the entire time trying to convince them to ask Grandpa to give Daddy money for his important work, making them complicit in his schemes, and confusing them about why adults were fighting over money, when all they wanted was their dad to push them on the swings. Rachel documented everything and took him back to court, where the judge was not amused by Brian's sudden interest in custody that coincidentally aligned with his need for money, and actually reduced his visitation to supervised visits only after he was caught telling Jacob that Mommy was stealing money that belonged to Daddy, which was a lie that traumatized a 7-year-old who didn't understand why his parents were fighting. I continued supporting Rachel and the kids, increasing the monthly amount to $3,000 when her car broke down, and she needed reliable transportation to get to work and take the kids to school and activities, because that's what family does. They step up when someone needs help, not demand returns on investment or equity stakes in their children's lives. Brian's response was to post on social media about how his toxic family was holding him back, and how successful entrepreneurs had to be willing to sacrifice everything, including relationships that didn't serve their vision, which was his way of spinning his abandonment of his children as some kind of noble sacrifice for the greater good of his imaginary empire. Several of his investor friends reached out to me after seeing his posts, concerned about his mental state and his ability to manage their money, and I was honest with them about Brian's pattern of prioritizing his ego over everything else, which led to several of them pulling out of discussions about funding his new venture, because even in Silicon Valley, family abandonment is bad optics. This led to Brian sending me a long email about how I had ruined his life and destroyed his dreams by sabotaging his business relationships. But I simply responded with photos from Emma's birthday party that he had missed and Jacob's first baseball game, where the little boy had looked hopefully at the stands for a dad who never showed up because he had a networking event that was more important. The irony was that if Brian had just been a decent father showing up for his kids and paying proper child support, I would have probably helped him with his business. Because I believe in supporting family dreams, but not when those dreams come at the expense of children who didn't ask to be born and didn't deserve to be abandoned for the possibility of IPOs and stock options. Rachel started dating someone new about 6 months ago, a man named David, who was a firefighter and the complete opposite of Brian's stable, reliable present, and genuinely interested in Emma and Jacob, not as baggage from Rachel's previous marriage, but as amazing kids who deserved love and attention which they hadn't gotten from their biological father in years. Brian lost his mind when he found out, posting rants about Rachel moving on too quickly and poisoning his children against him by introducing another man into their lives. But the truth was that David had shown up to more of their events in 6 months than Brian had in 2 years, and the kids adored him because he actually paid attention to them. When Emma won the school science fair, David was there cheering her on while Brian was at a startup conference in Austin. And when Jacob scored his first goal in soccer, David lifted him on his shoulders while Brian was having drinks with potential investors who would ultimately pass on his pitch because it lacked substance, just like his commitment to fatherhood. I invited David to family dinners and treated him like the son-in-law he would probably become, because he was doing the job Brian had abandoned, being a father figure to children who desperately needed stability and love, and Rachel deserved someone who saw her as a partner, not a prop in his success story that he could discard when convenient. Brian accused me of replacing him with David, but I told him you can't replace something that was never there, and David wasn't trying to be their father. He was just being present, which was more than Brian had managed in years, despite having every opportunity and resource to be part of his children's lives. The trust funds I set up for the kids have grown with good investments and will fully cover their college education and give them a start in life without debt, which is more than Brian's various failed companies have produced, despite burning through millions of other people's money, including mine from previous bailouts. I now regret enabling his delusions. Rachel has been able to quit her second job thanks to my monthly support and focus on being a teacher and mother without the constant stress of financial survival. And she's repeatedly tried to thank me, but I tell her she's the one doing the hard work. I'm just doing what Brian should have been doing all along, supporting his children. Emma recently wrote me a letter thanking me for being the best grandpa in the world and saying she wants to be successful like me when she grows up. But I wrote back telling her that success isn't about money or companies, but about taking care of the people you love and being there when they need you, which she already understands better than her father ever will. Jacob made me a Father's Day card last year, even though I'm his grandfather, because he said I was more like a dad than his actual dad. And while it broke my heart that he felt that way, it also made me proud that I could fill that void in his life, even if it meant accepting that my own son had failed as a father. Brian's latest startup is failing again, according to mutual acquaintances, and he's been reaching out to other family members trying to get money, but word has spread about how he abandoned his kids, and most people are following my lead in refusing to enable his behavior, choosing instead to send gifts and support directly to Emma and Jacob through Rachel. My brother Robert actually called Brian out at a family reunion, saying that real men take care of their children before chasing dreams, and that our father, who worked in a factory his whole life and never missed a single little league game, would be ashamed of what Brian had become, which led to Brian storming out and blocking most of the family on social media. The extended family has rallied around Rachel, and the kids with cousins including them in activities and holidays, while Brian posts bitter messages about being excluded from his own family, not understanding that he excluded himself when he chose his ambitions over his children, and expected everyone to subsidize his selfishness while he played entrepreneur. I've rewritten my will to leave everything in trust for Emma and Jacob with Rachel, as the executor in specific language that Brian cannot access any of it even as their father, because I know he would drain their inheritance for whatever scheme he's running when I die, and leave them with nothing but broken promises and resentment, just like he's doing now. Brian found out about the will change through a cousin and threatened to contest it, but my lawyer assured him that courts rarely overturn wills that provide for grandchildren, especially when the parent has a documented history of financial irresponsibility and child abandonment, which Brian has created through his own actions and social media posts. The saddest part is that Brian is actually brilliant and could have been successful if he had understood that real success includes being a good father, and that no amount of money or recognition can replace the relationship he's thrown away with his children, who are growing up without him and will remember his absence long after his companies are forgotten. Sometimes he sends the kids expensive gifts, trying to buy their affection with the latest gaming console or designer clothes. But Emma and Jacob have learned that expensive gifts don't make up for missed birthdays and broken promises, and they would trade all the presents for one afternoon of their dad actually being present and engaged with them. Rachel has done an amazing job of not turning the kids against Brian, despite having every reason to hate him for leaving her to struggle alone, and she still encourages them to love their father, even though he makes it nearly impossible by consistently choosing everything else over them, and then wondering why they don't run to him when he occasionally remembers they exist. I've documented everything in a journal that I plan to give to Emma and Jacob when they're older, so they can understand that their grandfather saw what was happening and tried to protect them and provide for them when their father wouldn't, and that they were never the problem despite what Brian's absence might make them feel. The money I give to Rachel isn't just financial support, it's an investment in my grandchildren's stability and happiness, and every dollar spent on their education activities and well-being is worth more than any return Brian's imaginary companies could ever generate, because the return on investment in children is measured in their growth, confidence, and knowledge that someone believes in them. Brian recently posted about cutting toxic people out of his life and focusing on those who support his vision, not realizing that he's the toxic one who cut his children out of his life, and that supporting someone's vision doesn't mean enabling their delusions and abandoning of responsibilities while they chase fantasies funded by other people's money. I still love my son because that's what fathers do, but I don't like who he's become, and I can't support his choices when those choices hurt innocent children who didn't ask to be born to a father who sees them as inconveniences to his ambition, rather than the greatest success he could ever achieve if he would just show up for them. Rachel sent me a video last week of Jacob's school concert where he played the recorder terribly, but with such joy and concentration, and I cried watching it, not just because I was proud of my grandson, but because Brian missed it for a pitch meeting that went nowhere just like all the others, and Jacob didn't even ask if Daddy was coming because he's learned not to expect anything. The trust funds now have enough money to cover not just college but graduate school if the kids want it. And I've added provisions for starting businesses or buying homes, because I want them to have every opportunity their father is too selfish to provide, and to know that someone in their family prioritized their future over ego and empty ambitions. Brian's latest message to me was that I'm enabling Rachel to turn his children against him. But the truth is he turned them away himself. Every time he chose a conference over a concert, a meeting over a meal, a pitch over a play, and children remember who showed up for them, and who didn't regardless of blood relations or legal titles. David proposed to Rachel last month and asked for my blessing, which I gave enthusiastically, because he's been more of a father to Emma and Jacob in 2 years than Brian has been in their entire lives, and they deserve a stable family with a man who puts them first not last on his priority list after investors, employees, and his own ego. Brian threatened to fight the adoption if David and Rachel marry, but his lawyer reminded him that abandonment is grounds for termination of parental rights, and his documented absence from his children's lives would make any custody fight not just unwinnable, but potentially result in him losing even the limited rights he currently ignores, which finally shut him up about legal action. The kids call David Daddy David now and Brian Daddy Brian, when they have to reference him, which says everything about how they view these two men in their lives, one who is actively present, and one who is theoretically their father but practically a stranger who sends occasional gifts and broken promises wrapped in excuses about building empires. I'm setting up a family foundation that will provide scholarships for children of single parents who have been abandoned by the other parent, because I've seen firsthand how financial stress compounds the emotional trauma of abandonment. And if I can help other families avoid what Rachel and my grandchildren went through, then Brian's failure as a father might at least serve as a cautionary tale. The foundation will be named after my late wife Brian's mother, who would have been heartbroken to see what her son became, but would have loved Rachel like a daughter and Emma, and Jacob like the grandchildren she never got to meet. And I know she would have supported my decision to protect them from Brian's selfishness, even if it meant cutting off our own son. Brian will probably never understand that he had everything a man could want: a loving wife, beautiful children, and parents who would have supported him in any reasonable dream. But he threw it all away for the possibility of being the next tech billionaire, not realizing that he was already rich in ways that matter, and now he's poor in every way that counts. Emma asked me recently why Daddy doesn't love them enough to visit, and I told her that Daddy loves them, but he's sick with something called ambition that makes him forget what's important, and maybe someday he'll get better. But until then, she has so many people who love her and will always show up for her, which seem to satisfy her for now, though I know harder questions will come as she gets older. Jacob still asks occasionally if Daddy will come to his games, and I always say maybe, while knowing the answer is almost certainly no, because Brian has proven repeatedly that his children's milestones mean nothing compared to the possibility of a successful exit or acquisition that exists only in his imagination, and the PowerPoint presentations he shows to increasingly skeptical investors. The money I've given to Rachel over the past 2 years totals close to $100,000, which is twice what Brian asked for originally. But the difference is this money has actually produced returns in the form of happy, healthy grandchildren who are thriving despite their father's abandonment, rather than another failed company with nothing to show but debt and broken promises. I'm planning to increase the monthly support to $5,000 once Rachel and David are married, because David shouldn't have to bear the financial burden of raising Brian's children when Brian contributes nothing but DNA and disappointment. And I want them to have every opportunity to succeed in life despite starting with the disadvantage of an absent father. The irony is that if Brian had taken the energy he puts into his startup pitches and applied it to being a father, he would have been wildly successful at something that actually matters. But he's so blinded by Silicon Valley success metrics that he can't see the failure staring back at him in the mirror every morning, a man who gained nothing and lost everything that matters. Last week Emma won first place in the school spelling bee, and the photo Rachel sent me shows her beaming with pride holding her trophy with David on one side and me on the other, while Brian was notably absent, probably in another meeting about another app that will never launch because he lacks the follow-through and commitment that success actually requires, whether in business or family. The saddest part of this whole story is that Brian could still turn it around, could still choose to be a father, could still show up for his children and rebuild those relationships. But he won't, because that would require admitting failure and taking responsibility for his choices. And Brian has never been good at either, preferring to blame everyone else for his problems while demanding they fund his solutions. I've accepted that my son is a lost cause, but my grandchildren are not, and every dollar I give to support them through Rachel is an investment in breaking the cycle of abandonment and showing them that family means showing up, being present, and putting children first, not last, not sometimes, but always, because that's what real success looks like, not IPOs or valuations, but birthday parties and baseball games and ballet recitals. Rachel thanked me again yesterday for everything I've done, but I told her she's the hero in this story for protecting her children from their father's toxicity while still encouraging them to love him, and for building a new life with someone who understands that being a father is about presence, not presents, and that showing up is 90% of success in parenting and in life. If you like this story, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.